The bulk of the Earth's fresh water is locked away in the polar ice caps. If it was water and not ice, it would cause the world's oceans to rise by 100 metres. The frigid zones play a vital role in the planet's climatic system in ways that we are only just beginning to glimpse. But something is happening around the poles, something that we don't fully understand, and it's happening at frightening speed. At the extreme north and south of our planet, the polar regions are vast areas of snow and ice. At the south, the continent of Antarctica is larger than Europe or Australia. Levels of precipitation here are so low that it is a frozen desert, yet it contains 90% of the world's ice. Because the sun's rays strike the polar surface so obliquely, far less warming occurs at the poles. When it does rise, the sun stays close to the horizon, and in midsummer, it never passes below the horizon. In midwinter, it does not rise. Antarctica is a land of jagged mountain ranges, and it has the highest average elevation of all the continents. Huge shelves of ice stretch into the surrounding ocean, and glaciers flow across the lower coastal region. Most of the southern continent is covered by an ice sheet more than a kilometre thick. Much of this ice is ancient, with its lower levels having been laid down 1 million years ago. This combination of ice and high altitude makes Antarctica the coldest place on Earth, with temperatures as low as -89 degrees Celsius being recorded at Russia's Vostok research station. In the Arctic, the North Pole lies in the centre of a frozen ocean. The northern polar regions have far less landmass than the south, and it is in the Arctic that scientists have been watching the polar ice melting at an alarming rate. In Greenland, melt lakes are growing and glaciers are shrinking, and with so much of the Earth's fresh water locked up in polar ice, this melting, if it continues, will have a drastic effect on sea levels and ocean salinity. Greenland's glaciers are a major reserve of fresh water ice, and in fact hold enough water to raise the global sea level by several metres. The Arctic sea ice is collapsing at unprecedented speed, and one estimate suggests the Arctic Sea could be ice-free during the summer as soon as 2013. Species, such as killer whales, that rely on the oxygen-rich waters of the Arctic for food will be affected by changes in climate in ways we barely understand. Already, polar bears that hunt on the ice are being affected by diminishing ice flows, and numbers are dwindling. The bears are excellent swimmers, but the distances they need to travel through open water are increasing. These days, polar expeditions are common, with research teams relying on modern technology to protect them in extreme temperatures. But the early explorers had to rely on more primitive equipment. In 1915, Ernest Shackleton's expedition to the South Pole failed when its wooden ship Endurance was crushed in pack ice. After a 20-month ordeal, the team made it to the safety of the whaling station on the island of South Georgia. Captain Robert Scott's expedition to the South Pole between 1910 and 1912 was documented by photographer Herbert Ponting. His ship Terra Nova was based off the coast of Ross Island, far enough north to avoid problems with ice. A base was set up on the island, but while the ship was at hand, it served as the centre for the scientific investigations that would form a large part of the expedition's work. A rival expedition from Norway, led by Roald Amundsen, had the sole focus of reaching the South Pole. When Scott's small team finally got there, they found a tent left behind by Amundsen, who had beaten them by a month. Scott and his 4 companions all died on the journey back from the pole. They were less than 20 kilometres from their next supply base. They had dismissed the use of dog sleds that the Norwegians had successfully employed. Today, sophisticated equipment and a greater knowledge of the extreme geography mean that polar expeditions, while still dangerous, can be achieved with fewer people and less risk. In March 2006, Conrad Dickinson and Richard Webber set out from Canada's Ward Hunt Island for the North Pole, a distance of 775 kilometres. They had no dogs, they would not use any wind-assisted technology, and they had to drag all food, fuel and equipment in their special sleds known as pulks. The outfits they wore to protect them from the cold weighed in at 13 kilos, and the pulks each carried 120 kilos, which made them difficult to handle in rough terrain. Webber and Dickinson were wearing snowshoes for traversing ice filled with broken pressure ridges. On some days they would travel only 3 kilometres. Both men have had long experience of the polar climate, and they realised that conditions were changing. By April, cracks were appearing in the ice, something that would normally not happen until May. Dickinson and Webber realised that they would have to race to the pole to beat the full moon, which would trigger high tides that would crack the thinning ice. The plan called for the two to be picked up from the pole by a Canadian ski plane, but 17 days before they were due, bad weather set in, cutting visibility to zero and making it impossible for their plane to land. They would have to walk to a temporary Russian base at 89 degrees that itself had to pull out before warmer conditions made the ice unsafe. Finally, after 52 days, Dickinson and Webber made it to the North Pole and then safely to their pickup point. But not all expeditions go so smoothly. Two Americans, Lonnie Dupre and Eric Larson, were to try a similar unsupported expedition, this time crossing the Arctic Circle from Siberia to the North Pole and then on to Canada. There was one key difference. Dupre and Larson would cross in summer in an attempt to raise awareness of the melting ice cap. A summer crossing had never been attempted before because thin ice and stretches of melt water were regarded as too dangerous. Instead of sleds, they were dragging canoes, and they wore special immersion suits to protect them from the icy waters. After several days, Dupre and Larson started to feel the ice beneath their feet vibrating. Currents beneath the ice were so strong that the plates of ice they stood on were swirling and grinding against each other. Although they had no support teams, Dupre and Larson did have a satellite phone to call for help if their lives were threatened. Before too long, progress was so slow that the pair decided to try paddling through the thin ice. Soon the two realised that on some days, although they had traversed 10 kilometres, they were actually 15 kilometres further from their goal. The ice was moving south faster than they could travel north. Polar bears became a hazard as well. Several times the pair were stalked by bears as prey. After just 16 days, Dupre and Larson realised their mission was futile and called for a rescue helicopter. They had to wait a further 9 days before conditions were clear enough for their rescuers to land. After all their efforts, the two had actually only progressed 50 kilometres after having travelled 240 kilometres. As well as their equipment, Larson and Dupre brought back snow samples collected every 25 kilometres, which would be analysed for heavy metal contamination. On the flight out, the expeditioners saw that to the southwest of their pickup site, there were great expanses of open water. The collapse of the Arctic sea ice has been so dramatic that almost 1/3 of the ice cap is now ocean. In Greenland, the ice is also melting at an increasing rate. Over the last 2 decades, weather observations show a rise in temperature, and glaciologists believe that this increased water supply is leading to accelerated glacier flows. Disko Bay in West Greenland, glaciologist Jason Box and polar explorer John Helscher have been using depth survey equipment on a number of melt lakes within the ice sheet. They want to estimate the melt water volume in lakes over the entire ice sheet by comparing the depth of a melt lake and its shade of blue. The volume of melt water is important because it plays a role in accelerating the movement of the ice sheet. Scientists say if the whole of the Greenland ice sheet disappears, the sea level worldwide could rise by up to 7 meters. This reduction to the massive ice sheets of the Arctic region is already affecting the polar bear. Their hunting season is shorter, and they are storing less fat to see them through the leaner months. Scientists from the Norwegian Polar Institute have started tracking the bears to record their weight and body fat and to monitor their hunting pattern. They use anesthetic darts fired from a special rifle to temporarily put the animal to sleep. Though polar bears are not on the endangered species list, they could suffer localized extinction or worse as a result of warming temperatures. With the animal immobilized, the field workers in the Norwegian territory of Svalbard can safely approach. So far, the research has revealed that by the summer, polar bears are thinner and their cubs are nearing starvation. There are only 22,000 polar bears left, and if the Arctic ice continues to melt, they will be extinct within 60 years. This animal is a female, and various aspects of her condition are checked and recorded. The field teams are in a race to document the bear's behaviour before conditions have changed too drastically. A baseline study of the polar bear's requirements and habits could be crucial in helping to preserve the species. A blood sample is taken for later analysis. This will yield information about the animal's level of nutrition, its reserves of fat, and any health problems it may be suffering. In less than an hour, the bear will have recovered from the anaesthetic and resume her wanderings. Finally, the research team tag the bear's ear for future identification. Polar bears spend much of their time roaming the ice that covers the Arctic seas for most of the year. They hunt for prey such as the ringed seal. Because it's relatively easy to track and study individual bears over many years, the polar bear is being used as an indicator to reveal the kind of pressures Arctic species are having to contend with. The huge white bears are great swimmers, spending hours at a time in the icy waters, moving between different stretches of pack ice. Because this ice is thinning, the polar bear has to travel greater distances, yet catches less food. Further to the east, scientists aboard the Coast Guard icebreaker Healy are trying to get a clearer picture of the Arctic's marine environment and what lives there before the thinning ice completely disappears. Under the ice, the researchers are documenting creatures that have never been seen before. To carry out detailed observations in the freezing conditions presents unique problems, but the ship has a fully equipped laboratory which serves as a base for work on specimens collected in the icy waters. The northern polar ice cap always grows in winter and shrinks in summer. However, for the fourth consecutive year, that melting has been greater than average. The team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks will return in 5 years to make comparisons with the baseline study they're carrying out now. The Kangerlussuaq Glacier on Greenland's east coast has become one of the world's most rapidly moving glaciers. Using a high-precision global positioning system, scientists have discovered that the 1,000-metre thick, 7-kilometre wide glacier is moving ice and snow towards the sea at the astonishing speed of 38 metres a day. In addition, It has retreated by around 5 kilometres in 4 years, after having been stable since measurements began 40 years ago. The Kangerluarsuk Glacier is an outlet glacier, a frozen river carrying ice and snow from the heart of the Greenland ice sheet to the ocean. Any change in its speed will have an effect on the growth or reduction in size of the ice sheet, with serious implications for increases to the global sea level. For a better idea of the diminishing polar ice, the European Space Agency is about to launch a polar orbiting satellite called Cryosat-2 to monitor the changes to both the ice caps. Situated in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, barely 1,000 kilometres from the North Pole, is the Svalsat ground station. To have frequent contact with satellites in north-south orbits, a station must be close to one of the poles. The first Cryosat was lost due to launch failure in 2005. The new mission's objectives remain the same as before. From an altitude of just over 700 kilometres and reaching latitudes of 88 degrees, Cryosat-2 will monitor precise changes in the thickness of the polar ice sheets and floating sea ice to further our understanding of the relationship between ice and global climate. Already, the station monitors ESA's Envisat. It's equipped with special radar for making land measurements and tracking icebergs like the giant B-15 that split away from the Antarctic ice field several years ago. It is feared that worse is to come. It was thought that the effects of global warming were not evident at the planet South, but new research in Antarctica has shown a similar pattern of outlet glaciers flowing faster and coastal ice breaking up. A research team has come to Antarctica's Dome Sea to study the ice itself. The European Project for Ice Core in Antarctica, known as EPICA, includes scientists from 10 different European countries. Here, the ice sheet is as thick as 3 kilometres, and locked within it are tiny air bubbles, some trapped as long ago as 800,000 years. Each one is an accurate record of the makeup of the Earth's atmosphere at the time it was laid down. By drilling into the ice, the EPICA team can gather ice cores that correspond to different periods of the Earth's history. Each 3-metre section of the ice core represents several hundred years. Already, analysis has revealed that atmospheric levels of CO2 have risen by 30% since pre-industrial times. The ice cores show yearly banding that tell the research team how far back in time the different sections of ice were laid down. In addition, contamination bands indicate global events such as volcanic eruptions or catastrophic meteor impacts. Each section is clearly marked and then cut into shorter, more manageable lengths for transport back to laboratories in Europe, where detailed analysis will be carried out. Here is a record of the changes in our planet's atmosphere, stretching back almost 1 million years. During this period, the atmosphere's CO2 levels have fluctuated in line with widespread volcanic activity, but even the most rapid of these changes has happened at only 1/50th of the rate of the human-induced change that has occurred over the last 150 years. Antarctica is good for studying ice, but the Arctic is the place to study the ocean, particularly the circulation of the ocean. For the 4th straight year, an international team of scientists has set up camp on the sea ice. The difference in temperature between the poles and the equator drives the ocean currents. The difference in the salinity of the ocean and the fresh water that comes from river outflows, rainfall and polar meltwater also plays a part in the top to bottom mixing of seawater. The field scientists deploy a series of monitoring buoys and deep water mooring cables that bristle with sensors to sample temperature, salinity, and oxygen levels at varying depths in the Arctic Sea. Team members, using a small aircraft, set up stations along a line stretching several thousands of kilometres. At each station, a hole was drilled and a cable carrying instruments was lowered to a depth of almost 1,000 metres. Using a hot water apparatus, the team melted a 1-metre hole through the ice. Then a tripod was set up from which to lower the instruments and mooring line into the salt water. While these buoys float with the ice pack, which will eventually break up, the mooring is located at a fixed position under the ice. Chained to the line are 13 oceanographic instruments. The circulating ocean moves heat from the equator to the poles. This is an important, though poorly understood, component of the Earth's climatic system, and the monitors will shed light on the changes that are happening in polar waters. Over the past 10 years, dramatic changes to the atmosphere, ice, and the Arctic Sea have occurred that scientists feel are just a small part of the variations in climate that are happening across the planet. There are so many variables which affect the climate that scientists are struggling to understand the complex, interrelated nature of the system. White cloud and white ice both reflect a great deal of radiant energy from the sun back into space. The darker open ocean absorbs heat, so the more things change, the greater the rate of change. Climate science is racing to understand the nature of these changes, but it is already clear that elevated levels of atmospheric CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels is acting like a warming blanket around the world. Across the planet, glaciers are diminishing, but these are only the most obvious signs of global warming. If we are unable to reverse the effects of climate change, the first victims will be the animals, adapted for life in the icy extremes and the places they call home.